So now let's go ahead and open up the box model.html. So what the heck is a box model and why should you even care, right? The box model is really very important, an essential part of CSS. If I roll my cursor over this particular container on my page and click on it, we see the box model. Every element is either basically an inline or a block element. A box is just that, a block element on my page. For those of you who come from print, think of a box like a text box and maybe InDesign. InDesign is frame-based as well, so think of it kind of like that. So my box itself is made up of several different elements. I have a margin, a border, and padding, and my content area. So the width of the box is determined not by the margin, but by the border and the padding inside of my box. So you'll see by the actual CSS markup inside my box that I have an actual box, and inside of my curly braces are my properties and their values. So I have a margin of 20 pixels. The fact that I don't have margin top, margin right, margin bottom, and margin left, I've just used a little shorthand to not have to type all of those 4 different elements. And when we start typing CSS, you'll see what I mean. Same thing with my padding. I have a 10 pixel padding. I have a border of 5 pixels all the way around. My width is 400 and my height is 200. So when I take a look at my box model, my box is not actually 400 pixels. I need to do a little addition. So my padding on both sides, my left and my right, would be then 20 pixels. So I'm up to 420 pixels. If I add my border on each side, I have 5 on each side, so I'm up to 430 pixels in width. So I now no longer have a 400 pixel width box. Now if I'm trying to put 2 boxes side by side inside of another container that is a fixed width, then I could totally be in trouble with the size and the width of my box. We need to keep this in mind as we work. So let's take a look. My margins are always transparent. My borders can be solid, dotted, inset, all sorts of things, although not all of those items display exactly the same on every browser. So when we take a look at those, we'll make sure and point out which of those actually look the same in all the browsers. My background settings for an element applied to the area just inside the borders, which includes both the padding and my content area, just like we mentioned earlier. So my width includes my borders and my padding inside of my content area. Now a box can contain any number of other boxes. So I could have a box inside of a box inside of a box inside of a box. Now just like we used to do with tables, we've seen some pretty hideous sites with tables inside of a table inside of a table inside of a table. So this is probably another part where we could say just because you can doesn't mean you should put a box inside of a box inside of a box inside of a box. It may also seem initially strange, but margins can even be a negative value. My margins are an important part of a box. So for instance, I could have it centered in the middle of my page. I could make sure, like the one that's on there right now, it has a margin. And so it doesn't go all the way over to the very edge of my page. So I can use my margin for positioning as well. So another important part of that is that the browser window serves as the root element for the hierarchy. So that brings us to another topic of positioning, which we will get more in depth a little bit later on. So I've got different box types. So I've got 2 basic types. I've got block and inline. My block types are my p tags, my divs, or heaven forbid, a table. We use tables quite a bit still. Tables are great for data. Remember, they're just not for layout. We use divs for layout. My inline boxes are generated by tags, like my strong or my M. For those of you who have been in web design previously and maybe just getting back into using Dreamweaver CS5, then we don't typically use our B tags and our I tags any longer. So no B for bold, I for italic. We use strong for bold and M for italic, and no, it's a different measurement than an M. I know that can be a little bit confusing, but it's definitely a different measurement. And we can also use span and actual content like text or images. We'll get more into spans and things like that later as well. So we've got some basic positioning, 3 basic schemes: normal, float, and absolute. We refer to them as AP elements inside of Dreamweaver. Normal is the default though, so containers can fall under each other, not side by side. So if I have 2 containers, maybe they're not even exactly the same width, they're always going to be underneath one another. Now, inline boxes are wrapped as needed, and we'll talk more about that, and that can get ugly and overlapping really fast. Relative positioning is designated by position, colon, relative, semicolon, and we'll talk more about the actual structure of our CSS in a bit. This can be a bit tricky, and we'll explain more of that in depth later. But meanwhile, just kind of think of it as relative to what? Relative to the browser, relative to another container, etc. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. Floats are something that always kind of trips people up, and we'll make sure that you understand floats. They're really not all that hard. So typically a float is either left or right. Think of it like an image inside of a box that has text in it, and you want that text to wrap around that image, not the image to sit all kind of by itself. You want the text to wrap around it. Or think of it as you want 2 boxes actually side by side. Now normally we said that the containers cannot be side by side. They're going to fall underneath one another. So being able to float that side by side is kind of essential, and there's several different ways to do that, obviously, and again we'll take a look at that in a little bit. But there's some basic rules before we get into floats and think about floats. So for instance, a float on a container needs to have a width assigned. Now, they're always also treated as block level containers. So they could accidentally overlap other containers if not treated properly, if not cleared properly. They will float over top of other items on the page. So when we have 2 or more items are floated and there's not enough space, then the other one will align to the bottom of the box beside it because you haven't necessarily done your math correctly. So we have to keep our box model in mind when we're floating those elements so that we aren't adding too much room or too many pixels side by side, because all of that math has to add up. The structure of my HTML is also very important. So if I have 2 containers that I want to be side by side and only one of those is going to float, the other is going to use margin to push itself away from the float container, then that float container has to sit above my other non-floated element in my HTML.